I am very excited to kick off this lecture series with Professor Ralph Armbruster Sandoval from the Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies at UCSB, not only because he was my professor during my very first quarter at UCSB back in 2015, but I've also gotten to witness firsthand some of the student movements he will be discussing today. Professor Ralph Armbruster has been working on campus since 1998 and is also the faculty director of the UCSB's Community Labor Center, which conducts research on issues and topics that seek to improve the lives of working and middle class families on the Central Coast. His current research focuses on social movements, racial studies, urban studies, Central America, and liberation theology. His lecture today will specifically cover the activist histories of UCSB Chicano and Latinx students on campus from the late 1960s up until the present. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Armbruster Sandoval. Enjoy your lecture.
Wow. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that wonderful introduction. I wish I could see you and talk to you all right now. Talking over Zoom is not something that I did definitely during COVID-19 and when education went online. So I have to kind of get back in the hang of doing this. But I want to thank the Office of Admissions for inviting me, our Executive Director, Cuca Acosta, Vanessa, and all the staff there at the Office of Admissions for making this happen today. So yeah, let me kind of jump into this. Or my slide's going to work here. There we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, today I'm going to talk, my lecture is called Hungry for Justice, UC Santa Barbara, Student Activism and Social Movements. And so social movements really at UCSB. Okay, so let's jump into that. A lot of people really don't associate UC Santa Barbara with activism. And activism means a lot of things to different people. But historically within the UC system, UC Berkeley was really known in the 1960s for something that was known as the free speech movement. And that movement involved lots of different students from different political points of view. People might be surprised that there were like liberal students and conservative students that were being prevented from passing out leaflets and information at the library and in other public spaces at the university. So people, I guess you could say they're like Democrats and Republicans. They kind of came together. It's nice when people come together despite their differences because they cannot like leaflet and, you know, they were like, hey, why don't you, we want to raise awareness about this issue or about that issue. And both of those like political tendencies, they were like, people were not allowed to pass out leaflets and to table and just kind of raise consciousness and educate people on their universities. And there was a famous incident at Berkeley with the free speech fight. Oh my gosh. And I'm not sure if pardon me, I think this might not be working properly. I wanted to show you all a speech. Oh my gosh. Huh. Let me try this again. Okay, there we go.
So here we are. 4 students are getting the axe. 6 organizations are getting the axe for standing up this semester and for fighting for these things. They're getting the axe not for what they did, but for what we have done. They spoke for us. They were part of us. They have been singled out, and they're going to be chopped off.
We were told the following: if President Kerr actually tried to get something more liberal out of the regents in his telephone conversations, why didn't he make some public statement to that effect? And the answer we received from a well-meaning liberal was the following. He said, would you ever imagine the manager of a firm making a statement publicly in opposition to his board of directors? That's the answer. Well, I ask you to consider, if this is a firm, and if the Board of Regents are the Board of Directors, and if President Kerr, in fact, is the manager, then I tell you something, the faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw materials. But we're a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to have any process upon us, don't mean to be made into any product, don't mean to end up being bought by some clients of the university, be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Okay. So that, so pardon me for that. I hope that you got to be able to hear that. Mario Savio was an iconic social justice activist. And when he spoke at Berkeley in 1964, it was like electrifying. You know, when Mario Savio said you have to put your bodies upon the wheels, upon the levers, and you've got to make the machine. That's the system, right? You've got to stop it from operating. And for my generation back in the 1990s, one of my favorite bands was Rage Against the Machine, which emerged in Los Angeles back in the 90s. And so that notion of the machine, the system, the structure, activists try to like slow that machine from operating and pushing it in a way that benefits most people, right? And so Berkeley was really associated with activism back in the 1960s. UCSB, not so much. And actually UCSB was established in 1944 during World War II, but its roots go back actually to the late 19th century. And UCSB was the third campus even created in the system. Berkeley was first, you know, in the 1860s. UCLA came online in the 1920s. And UCLA was actually called UCSB, University of California Southern Branch. And then they named it UCLA later. But so we were like the third campus ever in the system. And now we've got 10 campuses, of course, Merced, Irvine, San Diego, Santa Cruz, and so on, right? And so when UCSB kind of got going in the 40s, up until like the 1960s, the campus was mostly just white students, honestly. The number of Black and Latino or Chicano students was just about 1%. If you combine both of those two communities, there were very few what we call Black and Brown or Black and Latino students on this campus. It was very minimal, right? In 1968, Dr. King, of course, was assassinated. Senator Robert Kennedy, while he was running for president, was famous in Los Angeles. He was assassinated as well. There was a mass offensive in Vietnam because the Vietnam War started in 1965. It was called the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was, you know, like this, the US policymakers were saying, hey, we're winning the war, and sooner or later we're going to bring the troops home. That Tet Offensive showed that that was basically a lie. We weren't winning the war. Also in the late 60s, the United Farm Workers with Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, and also the Filipino workers, they were doing the Great Boycott. There was a civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, feminist movements. Lots of stuff was going on in the late 60s. Here on our campus, just to kind of give you, like, again, little known history, is that in October 14th of 1968, in the midst of lots of things happening locally at the state, on campus, all over the world, also in Mexico City, students there at the UNAM, which is the main public university in Mexico City, they organized and several hundred students were killed because they were asking for basically a democratic form of government in Mexico. But here on our campus, 12 African-American students with the Black Student Union, they non-violently took over a computer center at North Hall, and they said, unless our demands are going to be addressed, we're going to destroy all the computer records. It was a really, really critical moment in our campus's history. And that was the year I was born, by the way, back in 1968. So these students were concerned about institutional racism on our campus, mostly in the athletics department. They had a lot of concerns about football coach and about athletics director, but they also wanted the curriculum in terms of our courses to change. Like they wanted classes that really emphasized basically the Black experience in the United States and Black history. and the overall low Black student enrollment. So they had, multiple concerns. Now, as that protest was going on, it was really amazing that Chicana and Chicano students joined in solidarity, right? So they knew the protest was going on. They went to North Hall, and some of those students had previously participated in these blowouts, they called them, or walkouts of about 5 East LA high schools back in March of 1968. That was historic as well. 10,000 students were demonstrating for better conditions in their schools. And they were also kind of upset about the Vietnam War too, because Chicanos were being drafted to go into the war, right? So lots of things were at foot. And when the Chicano students joined the African-American students, it was this multiracial coalition that started to emerge. It was exciting, at least from my perspective. That protest was effective. The Black Studies Department emerged out of this protest, and also the Chicano Studies Department, which I'm a member of, that also was established in 1970, okay? I'll be able to answer some questions and answers, like once I probably continue through the lecture, if anybody's chatting or asking questions right now. I'm just trying to focus on just the presentation for the moment. So these two departments were created. They never existed on our campus prior to that. As a result of this protest, also Black and Chicano student enrollment began to increase. And also that was in part because funding for this program called the Educational Opportunity Program, funding began to increase for that program. And that program, what it enabled what the campus to do was to send out counselors to local high schools to try to recruit Chicano and Black students to come to UCSB, right? And then once they got to UCSB, then they would actually begin to work with them directly to try to retain them to make sure that they graduated. It's one thing to try to recruit students to come here, like you guys maybe who are attending this webinar today. It's another thing to actually, work with people and to try to get them to register for classes, get financial aid, get housing, all these other kinds of things that students need in order to be successful. The EOP program was absolutely at the heart of these efforts back in the day and even now. Okay, so 1 year after this protest took place at North Hall, Chicana and Chicano students, faculty, staff members, and community members organized a conference here at UCSB. It was at one of the dorms, the residence halls called Francisco Torres. They changed the name a few years ago, and now it's known as Santa Catalina. And at this conference, they developed this like 80-page booklet that was a blueprint or a document for creating Chicano studies programs at universities all across the United States. And so that was really pivotal, right? Just kind of laying out a little bit of this history. This is in the year about 2012, about 10, 12 years ago, the Black Student Union again kind of organized on our campus, and they really demanded and asked the university to create like a pictorial display of the demonstration back during that era. And the administration agreed to that. So if you walk in North Hall at UCSB today, it goes to the administration building, and then another way goes is to the Arbor, where a lot of people kind of hang out and study and eat and stuff like that. But when you walk through this display, it's very inspiring and kind of like gives chills to me to see like what it was like back in that era. Here's like this specific picture shows Chicano students, kind of raising their fists saying, we support you guys and what you're doing right here. Again, this is all back in October of 1968. And a lot of those students there who were in support were people who were just high school students just months earlier. A lot of them were first and second year students. This is the cover of the booklet I told you about at the Plan conference, which was used to create Chicano studies here, but also Chicano studies across the state and really across the country. So later that year, 1969, Black, Chicano, and white students actually came together to work as a coalition around common issues. And they occupied our university center. It's called the UCEN, which it has like our bookstore, and there's Starbucks down there, and there's restaurants down there today. But back in the day in 1969, they took over the UCEN and they created something called the Free University. and they organized their own classes. Like undergraduate students were teaching their own classes. And it was very alternative way of like doing higher education. It was kind of amazing. It lasted for a few months. A year later, like around February of 1970, again, the Vietnam War was going on, lots of agitation all across the United States. There were some folks basically that burned down a branch of the Bank of America in Isla Vista. Isla Vista is adjacent to UCSB, is where lots of students live. It's been going on for at least 5 decades in terms of a student community there. Governor Reagan, who was later became president of the United States in the 1980s, Reagan imposed what they called martial law. Like tanks were called in and the National Guard were called into Isla Vista, and martial law was imposed, right? And nighttime curfew and stuff like that. Very critical moment in our campus's history. And then even a year before that, there was this huge oil spill in Santa Barbara, off the coast of Santa Barbara near Goleta and a little farther north from here. And that oil spill generated a huge outcry. And the very first Earth Day came out of this oil spill and created environmental activism here in Santa Barbara, nationally and internationally. And I have a couple slides about that too. This is a picture of the Bank of America that burned down. Today, it's actually a college classroom. It's called the Embarcadero Hall. Seats about 250 students. I've taught classes in there before. There's other support services in that building as well. And right across the street from it, there's a mural of the burning of the bank too at a local coffee shop. This is the oil spill that happened off of the Gaviota coast, which is kind of about 5 to 10 miles north from here. And this was very dramatic, and we talk a lot about climate change today and environmental activism and things like that. But Santa Barbara really was at the literal kind of ground zero for that back over 50 years ago. And it still is. Today, Santa Barbara has a tremendous amount of environmental activism and environmental studies at UCSB and so on. Just moving forward a little bit, there was a second takeover, actually, of North Hall back in 1975. There was a group of students that came together called the Students for Collective Action. Again, it was multiracial. This time, though, included Asian American students, Black students, Chicano students, white students. There were more women also involved in this. There were queer students that were involved. It was really like an eclectic coalition of different groups in terms of race and gender and sexuality, all working together. They had 5 or 6 different demands, and they worked together in collaboration with each other. In the 1980s, if you just kind of go forward, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do today, is kind of give you all like a little flavor, different decades of activism. African American students mostly were at the center of this, but there were allies. There's always allies, that are trying to do, from my perspective, the right thing. They came together to try to press the UC system to divest from the apartheid system in South Africa. That was a local movement. That was a national movement. It was an international movement that actually started in the 1960s. This is an amazing little slide. There's a UC professor named Amanda Joyce Hall. She gave a presentation on anti-apartheid activism back in the day. She just was hired here a few years ago. And what I like about this slide is our campus newspaper here is called the Daily Nexus. So it's not a great picture because somebody's head got in the picture, unfortunately, when I snapped it on my phone, and then I uploaded it. But you can see that it says the Daily Nexus. That's our campus newspaper. And the students that were protesting decided to call Cheadle Hall, which is named after a previous chancellor back in the 60s and 70s. They named it after Nelson Mandela, the iconic anti-apartheid activist and freedom fighter, was the first president of South Africa after apartheid fell in 1990, an amazing person. So you get to see a little bit of the flavor there from the campus newspaper. And just kind of letting you all know that there's been this really rich tradition of student activism and organizing on our campus. Students of color, again, mobilized in 1989 to press for an ethnic studies requirement, and they went on a hunger strike for 2 weeks. Really kind of amazing. And one of the things that they wanted this time, back in the day, 20 years earlier, they said, hey, let's get Black studies, let's get Chicano studies. Now they said they wanted an Asian American studies department. They first called for that in 1975. They didn't get it. In 1989, they said, we still want the same demand. We're really upset about that. We want an ethnic studies requirement, because basically the historical contributions of Chicanos, African Americans, Asian Americans, indigenous people, none of that was in the curriculum, right? It was a very kind of homogeneous kind of curriculum, right? So not only did they want like an ethnicity requirement, they also wanted a gender studies requirement, meaning to talk about the contributions of women, right? So it was an intersectional movement around race, around gender. This was a really kind of cutting edge thing in 1989. And they wanted to also create a multicultural center. There was like a little multicultural center that started a couple of years ago, but it was in a very cramped office space. So they said, let's expand it and make it bigger and make it more kind of aware on campus that people will do that. So those folks did it for 2 weeks. There's actually a couple of professors from the Black Studies Department that joined that hunger strike for a couple of days. And they got most of their demands, but the gender studies requirement was never introduced. The ethnic studies requirement was. And here at UCSB, just to let y'all know, I teach an introduction to Chicano history class with over 500 students. It's a general education requirement. The reason why 500 students take it is because a lot of them have to take it, right? But also the way that it's taught, I think, is, you try to be engaging, try to talk to students about what's going on in the world right now. And it's one of the funnest classes that I teach here, even though it's 500 students. And even though people take it as a requirement, it is a really good experience for lots of people, including me. After that hunger strike in 89, there was another hunger strike, right? Just like about 5 years later, 1994. Chicana and Chicano, Latina and Latino, right? The A and the O Indian are for men and for women, right? That's the terminology that we were using at one time. So Chicana, Chicano, Latina, Latino students associated with the student group El Congreso decided to go on a hunger strike. And you can imagine, y'all, I mean, hunger strike means literally starving, right? And you have to be right? These students had exhausted all other means to bring about change. They had been told, like, why don't you go here? Why don't you go there? Why don't you do all this? They were kind of, as we say in life, chasing their tails. And every time the administration was like, they just kind of tuned them out, right? So in my research, I started to call a hunger strike a way to speak in a spectacular way. There was a famous activist that said that it takes a loud voice in order to make the deaf hear. It takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear, right? So sometimes the best way to be heard is to stop speaking by not eating, right? And these students camped themselves outside of Cheadle Hall, our main administration building. And what these folks were asking for is they didn't want the fees to keep increasing in the UC system. In 1983, the fees increased by about 40%. It was very, very high. And honestly, back in the 1960s and even in the 70s, UC education was free. No money. Like you can imagine, so fees, steadily increased. And in 1983, they went up by 40%. That was very, very rude and very shocking for a lot of people. They wanted more faculty in my department, Chicano Studies. We only had 3 people back in 1970 when it started. And in 1994, they still only had 3. They wanted to create like a doctoral position or doctoral program in Chicano Studies. So people that could get a PhD and do more research on Chicanas and Chicanos. They wanted like a dedicated PhD program. They wanted to create a community center for Chicano Latino youth in Isla Vista, and also to work on immigration rights. They wanted grapes off campus because people that were picking grapes in the fields were being sprayed with toxic pesticides, and all kinds of physical and mental health issues were arising from working in the fields, right? They wanted more funding for the EOP program, and they wanted to keep this building called El Centro alive. UCSB had drawn up plans in the late 80s actually to destroy El Centro, which was created back during World War II. The Marines had basically took over Isla Vista. Again, this is before the university was here. And they had like a base here for a little while, for a couple of years, right? So they created this building, 1942. It was called Temporary Building TB 406. But it's kind of known as El Centro, right? And El Centro in the late 60s became the home of the Chicano Studies Department, the Center for Chicano Studies, Chicano EOP, and the Chicano Studies Library. And over the years, El Centro became kind of a home away from home. A lot of students did not feel welcome and invited and included at UCSB. I mean, literally back in the day, there was like maybe 50, 100 Chicano students, right? It didn't feel very inviting. And they're like, hey, where's the one place that I can go to hang out and just kind of feel safe? And that became El Centro. It's got this amazing artwork, these cultural expressions. It's a really great space to students study there, they eat there, they sleep there, they organize. And it's a great space to be in. So they wanted to get rid of that in 94. And of course, the students were angry about that. The hunger strike in 94 lasted 10 days. 9 students were involved. 7 of them were Chicana and Chicano, and 2 of them were Central American, more specifically, their Guatemalan ancestry. Of the 9 hunger strikers, 5 were men and 4 were women. The thing I think is really important for y'all to understand is one of the bigger things that they were facing in 1994 was there was this ballot proposition. Like when you go to vote, you're voting for the president, you're voting for the vice president, your local congressperson. But in California, we vote for these ballot initiatives, right? And it takes a long time to get a ballot initiative on the ballot. But this thing was called Prop 187. And it would have prevented undocumented immigrants from being able to go to school, basically, and also going to seek out healthcare services, right? So a lot of people felt like this is a very racist measure. It was deliberately targeting undocumented immigrants, Latino and Asian, and racial tensions in California were super, super high in 1994, a lot like today, right? Immigrants were being blamed for every social problem, in California. Moving the story forward, the strikers were successful. They got most of what they wanted. I was hired as a result of this hunger strike, right? When I first got hired here in 1998, some of the students that were on hunger strike were like seniors. A couple of these students are amazing. They were freshmen and they stopped eating. I mean, they really made a huge sacrifice and they created a lot of change on our campus. But one demand they didn't get was, unfortunately, fees were not frozen. I'm just going to look at my time here real fast. This is a really great picture from 1994 in the hunger strike. And the woman on the right here says, my son is a hunger striker. Her son is a guy named Tino Gutierrez. And Tino's an amazing guy. I talked to him. And the parents during this hunger strike were really frightened, of course, for their children. They didn't want them to have, bodily damage, if not die. But they told the administration, if you guys do not begin to negotiate in a serious way, we're going to join our children on the hunger strike. And that began to move the administration to start taking this seriously. Here's a couple of Chicanas. And usually in stories of activist movements, a big focus is on men, like iconic great men like Cesar Chavez or Malcolm X or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. but women have always been at the heart of every single social justice movement, and queer people and other people, in terms of intersectional identities. But I love this picture here because they're just fierce and they're standing up for their rights. This is a book that I published. We're Research One University, right? And the cover of the book here is two of the hunger strikers. The woman on the left her name is Naomi Garcia. And there's a man, you can't really tell, like in terms of their gender, so to speak, which is kind of purposeful in terms of the picture. His name is Edwin Lopez, and that's outside Campbell Hall at UCSB here. Campbell Hall is a huge lecture hall of 800 students, and they had a rally that day. And the hunger strike had, impacted their body, and they couldn't really walk around without assistance of wheelchairs, right? So anyway, I think that picture says a lot, or at least I hope it does. Let me just move on a little bit. The 94 hunger strike and the other waves of activism really began to change our campus's demographics, particularly for Chicanx and Latinx students. So much so that UCSB became an HSI. And that means basically a Hispanic serving institution. So 2015, 25% of our undergrads were now Chicanx or Latinx or Hispanic. Some of us don't use the word Hispanic, but the government uses that word. So sometimes we use that as well. So, it was just like 1% back in the day. In 1994, it was about 10%. Now it's like, 27, 28%. The admissions office has the more accurate numbers, but it's over 25%. 2 years after we became an HSI, kind of crazy thing happened is that UCSB declared El Centro was unsafe and it should be destroyed. So after all the organizing, dedication, sacrifice, they said, we're going to destroy El Centro. But students organized. They saved it, right? They saved it, took a year, and it continues to be a space that recruits and retains Chicanx, Latinx students. And the space is open to everybody. Black, Asian, Indigenous, todo. All students are definitely welcome at El Centro. But it really feels like a home for the Chicano Latino community. El Centro's had lots of iconic people. I just want to give their flowers and give love to people that I know, that I care about. Ozzy Espinosa, Jack Rivas, who's still here, Lupe Navarro Garcia, who I was going to say graduate. She retired last year. Pete Villarreal, Dr. Yolanda Garcia. They're all like legends here at UCSB. And they're my teachers too. In 2020 then, just a couple of years ago, student activism started to change with COVID. Organizations began to kind of decline with social distancing. And things kind of, for a couple of years there, they kind of just started to kind of disintegrate just a little bit. But then activism started going again. Oh, by the way, okay, look at this picture right here. This is El Centro, like when they did a ribbon cutting back in 2018 when they reopened it. I love that picture right there. El Congreso then organized in 2022. They said, hey, you guys, we need an HSI director. We need to stop Munger Hall, which was this huge mega dorm, which would have been unsafe. And they wanted to expand El Centro. Chancellor Yang, who's our chancellor, has been here for 30 years. He's actually going to retire in a couple of months. Chancellor Yang, and there was a committee here. They said, okay, you guys, you can renovate and you can expand El Centro, but there's not secure funding quite yet for the expansion. That's probably going to be several $1 million, and it could take 5 to 10 years to do that. But they said it's okay. So hopefully we can move forward and really substantially expand El Centro as a physical space. Last year, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, organized all year long to stop genocide in Gaza, right? Along with other student groups and also Academics for Justice in Palestine, which I'm a member of that too. SJP has met in El Centro for years. SJP then worked with other groups to try to pass a divestment measure with associated students regarding Israel. That's a long struggle that took years, and they were successful. They were successful in passing that measure back in June of 2024. Concurrently with that movement, there was a group of people that did an encampment next to the UCSB library. That lasted for about 6 weeks. And during that time, also a building here that's really close to where I'm at in South Hall, Gervais Hall, was occupied, and the police responded with massive force, something like I've never seen here in all my years, and I've been here for 26 years. The camp was finally taken down by the police, and 5 people were arrested. This kind of gives you an idea what, sometimes people are like, what did the encampment look like? And that's what it looked like for about 5 to 6 weeks. Campus protests then have sparked new policies, like from the University Office of the President regarding free speech. And a lot of people feel like, hey, we don't have the ability to speak or act freely like we used to. Even though the policies are supposed to protect free speech, some people are saying they're preventing free speech. And so those policies are generating a lot of fear, a lot of, not just the UC policies, but the new administration in Washington, D.C. Over the last couple of weeks. A lot of people are very afraid. They're feeling a lot of discomfort. They're feeling a lot of panic. They're feeling a lot of uncertainty. And literally over the last 4 or 5 days, especially here in California, there was about 100 protests, including here in Santa Barbara, Oxnard, Ventura, Los Angeles, down in Ontario, which is my hometown, in the Inland Empire. There's all this kind of activism that's been taking place over the last few days. So I'm kind of wondering, and I would like to talk to you guys with the last maybe few minutes that we have, what questions you might have, but also like what your thoughts about what's going on right now and how that might spark renewed activism. What do y'all think?